front yard that butts up against the lake used to be not there. It was landfill. So, you know, it's going to be interesting. We're in an area called Streeterville right here, which is the area east of Michigan Avenue. And it's become what is known today called the Magnificent Mile. Magnificent Mile is from the DuSable Bridge, formerly the Michigan Avenue Bridge, all the way to where it hits Lakeshore Drive. And the Magnificent Mile was, you know, originally just an ordinary street with residences, and it was, you know, not too exciting up until the 1920s. And then they realized the possibility once the bridge, Michigan Avenue Bridge, was completed, and they said, you know, we should do some retail along this street. And then they called it the Million Mile Street, Million Miles, or the $1 Million Street. And then in 1947, they really transformed it into the shopping district that it is today, and then it became the Magnificent Mile. This is the major shopping district of Chicago. It used to be State Street, which was the one mentioned in the Chicago song, and that was the home of a lot of department stores and things, but many of those department stores have moved out or they've moved here. Now we just left the area right next to the Hancock building. We'll see the Hancock building from the lake, and I'll show you a perspective of that. That's the fourth tallest building in the city. All right, as we drive down here, one of the first things you notice, and it's on all the postcards and posters, is the water tower. The water tower here, and over on the other side is the pumping station. These are the two buildings that were able to survive, miraculously, the Great Chicago Fire, which in 1871 destroyed 17,000 buildings in Chicago. They worked very hard to keep those going because that's what pumped the water out of the lake and into people's faucets. Remember, all of our drinking water comes from the lake. I'll tell you lake stories and pollution stories and things like that later. All right, what they did with this road over the years is they widened it greatly. It's called Pine Street, and then when they completely redid it, they widened it, so now it became a wide boulevard. And one of the things you notice in Chicago is that there is tremendous numbers of little gardens. Do you notice this? With the wrought irons, and they have the medians with the gardens, and they have beautiful hanging baskets and trees and things like that. It wasn't always like this. About 15 or so years ago, our former Mayor Daley went to Paris. And while he was in Paris, he noticed how beautiful everything was with the flowers and the gardens, and everything was just overflowing with beauty. And he wanted to recreate that in Chicago, sort of make Chicago a Paris on the prairie, which was an idea that was introduced back in 1909 by a man by the name of Daniel Burnham. He thought that would be a perfect thing, especially since we had this gorgeous river. We could make a river walk, and we could have, you know, gorgeous gardens all over. And after all, our motto for the city is Urbe Morto, which is Latin for city in a garden. And so make it into a beautiful garden, and it certainly is. They work very hard to water everything, especially during this very dry summer that we've been having. And they're out here, you never see them, the people who are tending all of these beautiful plants, unless it's very, very early in the morning. And then they're taking care of everything very fastidiously, which means very carefully. All right, as you can see, super busy street, lots of things happening, a very expensive place to live. And what's happening in Chicago, especially the area around the Magnificent Mile, or the area called the Near North Side, or the area near Millennium Park, is that many people have decided that they want to come back and they want to live in the city. That once their kids have grown up and they have left high school and you know, they're on to college, that they might want to go back and they live in the city. And so you're going to see, as you look around, lots and lots of condos or old buildings that used to be warehouses or businesses turning into condominiums. You can tell because these balconies sort of spring out from the side. So sometimes we'll go down the river and we'll see an old warehouse, and then they've got these balconies that have popped out. That's a good indication that there's probably a loft condominium there. By the way, for those of you who don't know the difference between apartment and condominium, an apartment is someplace that you rent so that you have to pay every month, and a condominium is the same type of place, but you own it. So it's like a home. It doesn't have a yard, but you own it. But in Chicago, we have over 566 parks. We make sure that we have lots of parks so that the people who live in the apartments and the condos have places where they can go and play, and the kids can have playground equipment, and the dogs even have their own parks. Sometimes they even have little tiny parks, which I'll show you, called parking parks, between buildings, so people have a nice place to go at lunchtime. All right, we're coming up on the, which way? swing around that way. Extra good to know. All right, well, we're going right over where we're going to board our boat. We're going to work our way down to a lower level so it's easier to access it with the bus. And we're crossing right now. Look at this view, beautiful view. Lovely night to go on the river. But we're crossing over what is now called DuSable Bridge, formerly Michigan Avenue Bridge up until a couple years ago. And now we're in sort of the older part of Michigan Avenue. Now, before the Great Chicago Fire, Michigan Avenue was literally up against the lake. And so if you can imagine, these buildings would be beach. And Grant Park, if you were to dig down below, for those of you who are budding archaeologists, if you were to dig down, like sometimes they have to do when they're building things, you would find relics from the Great Chicago Fire that they dumped there. Because if you can think about it, 4 square miles burned. They had to put all that debris someplace. And so they just dumped it in the lake. It filled up, landfill, put a little soil on top. You've got a front yard, which is the beautiful Grant Park. At a gorgeous fountain, the largest fountain in the entire world. You know that? Buckingham Fountain. And you have got a beautiful place to go and explore. Has anybody been to Millennium Park yet? What'd you think? Well, it is just magnificent. Do you know what Millennium Park used to be? Before it was Millennium Park? A parking garage. It was an ugly parking garage that was falling apart. And it was interesting because Mayor Daley, the former Mayor Daley, his dentist office was in a building that was right next to, right across the street from the parking garage. And every time he would go up twice a month, or twice a year for his 6-month exam, he would look out and he would see this unsightly view of the parking garage. And he said, this has to change. And so he was inspired. And with the help of many amazing architects and landscape designers, they created Millennium Park, which has become a very popular destination, especially on hot days, by those crown fountains. Did anybody have a chance to play in the crown fountains? The water? Pretty amazing, isn't it? All those pictures, and then they spit out the water. Those are pictures of Chicago. It's broken. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. But did you have a chance to see Cloud Gate, also called the Bean? That's amazing to see. Now, the Chicago didn't always, you know, sit as high as up as it did as it does right now. It used to be right on the level of the lake, and in the 1850s they raised it up because, well, it was a swamp, and there were all sorts of problems in terms of sanitation. And so, as you can see, as we're, you know, going next to the river, we have to go down to get to the river, and then we have to take a couple of stairs to get down to the actual river bank. Closest would be Molly, living in Jefferson, which is down in southern Illinois. But if they came to Chicago or they experienced Chicago during their lifetimes, what would they see, what would they experience? And I'll share that with you today. Well, we're starting out right here at what used to be the shoreline of Lake Michigan. Everything that is east of here is all added. It's landfill. And so if we were to turn back the time clock, and the year is, we'll say, 1764, the time of Kaya. What you would see, if you can imagine this, is looking straight east. All the buildings are gone. It is just wide open prairie with few scatterings of trees. There would be a few teepees over probably on the south bank as traders and perhaps various Native Americans who were looking for beaver skins and things like that would be in the area, but they would never settle here. Why? Because this is a swamp, and this swamp is stinky. And they named it Chickagua, which means smelly onions. And the name Chicago is a derivative, it came from Chicago. So technically our Chicago name means smelly onions. And sometimes you see references to that, they have onion images. In any case, so Kaya, who would have been in Montana, during 1764, this whole area was, again, not inhabited by any other than the Native Americans. It was in 1763 that 2 explorers came through, Marquette and Joliet. And what they were doing is trying to see what was here, because this area belonged to France. and they wanted to see what was here for the king. And so they explored the Mississippi River, and then their Native American guide said, come on back, we've got a shortcut. And they cut through a series of rivers, and they came down this river, very sluggish and small in comparison to today, and they said this would be an amazing spot because it connected the Mississippi and down to New Orleans, where Marie Grace and Cecile lived in 1853, all the way to the Great Lakes, and then all the way over to the Atlantic Ocean. So this became a very important spot. Now let's fast forward to 1803. Louisiana Purchase. Some of you who learned about Louisiana Purchase in school, what that did was double the size of our country. Now we got all this new land, and this became a very important spot. So they built a fort. And the fort was right up there. As we go up the stairs, you'll see brass pavement markers which indicate where the fort used to be. And on the building that you see that's beautiful, it's kind of curving at the corner, and it has the columns on the top. London Guarantee Building, that was from the 1920s. I'll tell you about that in a moment. That was the site of Fort Dearborn, and they have a little picture of it carved into the stone in front. And that became sort of a place where, you know, pioneers could go and they could get their mail and they could get supplies and things. The first settler in Chicago had his home right over there, but on, obviously, next to the river, and his name was Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, and that's why this bridge right here is named after him, Du Sable Bridge, also Michigan Avenue Bridge. All right, now we're going to fast forward, and now it's the 1870s, and the population has exploded from a small little pioneer town, and now it's over 300,000 people. And what ends up happening is that people want to build with the cheapest and easiest things they can find, which is wood. And so wood has come down from Wisconsin and Indiana and Michigan, and what they did was they built everything out of wood, sidewalks and buildings and factories, and it became sort of a tinderbox, an accident waiting to happen. And so what happened in the summer, it was actually October 8th of 1871, a fire broke out further south. We're going to see exactly where that began, and it spread north, and it went 4 miles, taking out 17,000 buildings. Fortunately, not killing very many people in comparison to how many people are left homeless, about 100,000. And so it created this blank slate. Nothing was here. The central part of Chicago was destroyed. Other parts of Chicago still remain, but the central business part destroyed. And that's where people who were architects from all over the world said, this is an amazing opportunity. We can come to Chicago and we can start trying to build something new and different that's never been built. The skyscraper. And the skyscraper was born here, starting in 1884. And that is what we see surrounding us now, skyscrapers. Skyscrapers are really metal frame construction, like our skeletons. All of us have skeletons, but we are clad, or we are skinned differently. Different colors of skin, we have different heights, we have different looks, and as a result, you know, each of us has our own unique appearance, and every single skyscraper also has its own unique appearance. All right, Nick, we can start going, and I'll start talking about these skyscrapers. So as we're going down the Chicago River, and this is the best place to learn about Chicago history and about the architecture, because it's like going down being in a time machine, going down a timeline. So you're going to see things from the 1800s all the way up to the present era. All right, I don't know if any of you noticed this, but you probably see some flags flying on the Du Sable Bridge. You see those flags? Of course, the American flag. And then the other flag, for those of you who are living from out of town or coming here from elsewhere, it's the Illinois flag. And then we have the flag that is white stripes, 3 white stripes, 2 blue stripes, and 4 red stars. Everybody see that flag? That's the official Chicago flag. And when you look at it, you go, oh, that's kind of pretty, nice colors. What does it mean? I'm going to tell you about the Chicago flag as we go on our tour. I'll tell you the first part right now. The 3 white stripes are about the sides of Chicago. The top one is the north side, the middle one is the west side, and the bottom one is the south side. And the east side they don't have because, of course, it's Lake Michigan. All right, so I was mentioning about different styles of buildings, and a great example of a building that was popular in the 1920s is this building to the left. You see a little temple on top. It's covered with a bit of a, looks like they're fixing it up, so it's a bit of a protective fencing. You see columns, and those are called Corinthian columns, and you see a lion with wings, and you see all sorts of decorations. This is a style called neoclassical. Now, the word neo means new. Classical, what are they referring to? What are they talking about? Make it look like ancient Greece or Rome. So they have a lot of things that you would see in ancient Greek or Roman buildings they put into these neoclassical, or sometimes a fancy French way of saying it is Beaux-Arts, like Fancy Nancy would say. And then looking up at the top, you see how the lights are coming on. You're going to see over the course of our tour, lights, very dramatic lighting is going to come on and make the buildings look amazingly special. The building that looks like a rocket that goes straight up to the sky, or it looks like a lipstick that you've twisted, that was the tallest building in Chicago for 7 days. And that was called the Mather Tower by Riddle and Riddle. It was finished in 1928. So that would be a little bit before Kit's time. And then look at, in contrast to that, we see something that says Hotel 71. Now this was a style called modern. So the style that you see with the tower going up to the top, that's called a Gothic style, which looks like a church steeple. And then next to it is very modern. It was very, very horizontal with the stripes. And that today was a hotel. They also filmed Batman up at the top, for those of you who might have seen it. As we're crossing underneath one of our many bridges we're going to cross across, by the way, we have more movable bridges in Chicago than in any city in the country. As we go underneath the bridge, look up right to your left, and you're going to see a building that again has that neoclassical style. We have 4 little temples at the side, and then a very, very tall temple at the top. And this is called the Jewelers Building. This is kind of a neat building because in the 20s, it was full of different jewelry companies. And what they wanted to do is make sure their jewels didn't get stolen. And so they would drive their car literally right into the front, and they would go into an elevator, and the elevator would take them to the floor, so that they didn't have to worry about accidentally being robbed on the way into the workplace. So Jewelers Building doesn't have that elevator anymore, but it was sure neat. That was designed by Guyver and Dinkeloo. And you know, it's interesting, you're going to hear some of the same architects named again and again because they did such good jobs that people kept hiring them to do more architecture. Now, has anybody ever heard of Tony the Tiger or Snap, Crackle and Pop or maybe Pillsbury Doughboy? Where did those ideas come from? Well, they came from right over here, 35 West Wacker Drive. That's the home of an advertising company called Leo Burnett. And they have come up with a lot of the very famous commercials that we see on TV and hear about. Now this style, again, is also modern. But what they wanted to do is they wanted to make it look like a column. And it looks a whole lot like that bridge house that's right there to the edge of the bridge. One of the things that's really neat about it is they put these little pencils in between the windows. And when the light hits it just right, it just sparkles. Right next to that building is a little tiny building, and that was from the 1960s. It kind of looks short in comparison to the 2 on either side. And that's a style that they made out of concrete. They didn't use the steel and glass, but they used reinforced concrete, like they would with some concrete streets. And they used very, very strong steel bars called rebar in the concrete so that it doesn't start falling apart. That style right there, 55, West Wacker, is called brutalism because it's strong and it's brutal, it's stark. Look in contrast, this is called a postmodern building. Now this was from the late 1990s, and this is the home of United Airlines, the headquarters of United Airlines. And this style looks a lot like that ancient Greece and Roman style, except a whole lot taller. You see it. They look like they have some columns on the front, but it's really just sort of pretend columns. They aren't supporting it. One of the things that you see is they have tinted glass, and the reason why is because people love to have windows, but they don't want all that sunlight coming in, so it kind of takes some of the brightness out of the light. This is a building they started a couple years ago to the left. It was going to be a beautiful hotel, except they ran out of money. But you can see how buildings are built, and you can see at the very top the rebar coming up that I mentioned, and you can also see the concrete, the reinforced concrete. So the bottom part would be a parking garage, and then above that would be a very tall hotel. And they're still trying to figure out what they want to do with that building, but it's interesting right now because you can see how a building is built. Now in the 1920s, the building to the left, this is called the LaSalle Wacker building, it looks like an armchair. Looks like you'd sit down in the middle of it and you put your arms right there. This was a style that was very popular because they had a rule that you could only build a building so high without making something called a setback. And that was because they didn't want to have all of these buildings lined up and make the streets dark like a canyon. So what they did was they created these little armchairs, or in some cases sort of a big couch. And you see this is a very popular style in the 1920s. Now if you look at this building to the left, this is called the Builders Building by Graham Anderson, Probst and White. They're a design firm. It looks like one part is a little bit different from the other part. And the way that they did it, one is built in the 1920s and the other one is built about 40 years later, is they connected it with the roof.
Remember the train that
the mansard roof. That means a flat top roof.
Yeah. See how it's elevated? It's called the L.
Now, if Rebecca were to be coming to Chicago, she probably would have explored it using this. This is the L. And the L was first built in the 1890s for the big World's Fair that was in Chicago. The only building left is the Science and Industry Museum. But what the L does, it goes into the city and it goes around in a big circle. And that big circle gives Chicago's center part the name the Loop, because it goes around in a big circle. And then it goes out into all the various neighborhoods. All right, Chicago's river has 3 branches. We're on the main branch, and then we're going to go down the south branch, but it also has a north branch as well. And right where the branches came together was a place called Wolf Point. And so we're getting to the area that was the original location of Chicago, where the pioneers first settled. 3 buildings are built by the same architecture firm right in a row, but they're very different. 225 that you see with the flag coming out of the grill, that was built in 1989. And you notice if you look straight up, you see a bridge almost on the top. It looks like a little bridge. That design makes you want to look at the bridges and say, hey, they just took the bridge design from the top. Has anybody been to Navy Pier? Been to Navy Pier? If you notice Navy Pier, they have, as you enter Navy Pier, that same design on the columns on the top. They kind of copied it from Navy Pier. You know, Navy Pier was built a lot earlier, in 1916. So the design firm of Cone, Peterson, and Fox was hired to do 3 buildings right in a row, which is very unusual. So they made that first one, 225, look like the other buildings next to it. That's called context, that it's in the context, or it relates to the things around it. This building next to it is a favorite in Chicago, and this is called 333. And this was also built in the 1980s, and it curves with the river, and it's also the same color as the river. The river is always kind of green because it has algae on the bottom, and so it kind of gives it that green look. It also gets very green during St. Patrick's Day when they dye it green, and it becomes bright green, neon green. The one wonderful thing about this building is that it reflects all the buildings around it and the sky. It's gorgeous. But the back follows the street, so it's a grid, so it's like a big piece of pie when you're looking at it. They put all of the workings of the building at the bottom. That's why you see the stone. And because the L goes rumbling by, they call the train, the raised train, the elevated or the L. They decided they didn't want to put windows there because it would be hard for people to concentrate. Do you notice if you look at the street, and that's called Wacker Drive, that Wacker Drive is double level. They designed this in the 1920s, and the idea was that people and cars could enjoy the top, and then trucks, and like garbage trucks and things like that, deliveries would be down below. And so it kind of took some of the congestion off of the top, and it wraps all the way around. Now, during Addie's time, a man by the name of Abraham Lincoln became president. Abraham Lincoln was nominated right over there where that gray glass building is today, in a temporary building in 1860 called the Wigwam. It was a temporary political convention center, and Abraham Lincoln was nominated there. Remember, in Addie's last book, she reads the Emancipation Proclamation, which he wrote. We're going underneath the Lake Street Bridge, and if you were to take the green line, it goes right out to Oak Park, which some of your parents might be familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright. Give me a nod if you've heard of Frank Lloyd Wright. He's a very famous architect. And Some of his was home and studios located in Oak Park, as well as most residences of any town are located there. He's got a big collection. This building, which is called the Great Lakes Building, was designed in the 1914. So during Rebecca's time, this is a style that would be very common. What you would see is the skeleton just covered by the brick. And then you'd say very big windows. They needed very big windows because they didn't have very bright light bulbs. And also because they could open the windows at the time to allow the light, or not only the light, but also the air in so that they could get some ventilation. And they didn't make them very tall necessarily yet. They started making the very tall buildings starting in the 1920s, a little later. Now, one of the things you hear when you get into this area is some rumblings of trains. You see over to your right, lots and lots of train tracks. It was in 1848 that Chicago started its first train, as well as connected with the Mississippi River through a canal. And in the 1960s, when they said, how? This is great land. We would love to build on this, but they're train tracks. What do we do? Well, they decided to sell. The train companies decided to sell the air rights above the train tracks, and they built above the air, or in the air above the train tracks. And it made it, amazing, because here these buildings are kind of just straddling over the train tracks. I'll point that out as races on the river too. You see that periodically. Now, looking up ahead, that's the North Branch. And the North Branch was the most industrial part, but today it's becoming very residential. So you see beautiful, again, condos and apartments along there, very expensive. The building that says Chicago Sun-Times didn't used to have windows. Believe it or not. This was called the Apparel Center. It was built in the 1970s, Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, and it was originally where people would go from stores if they wanted to buy clothing for their store, and they didn't want to have any windows. They just had, basically. This building, designed by Graham Anderson, Probst, and White, was the home of the Chicago Daily News. And she probably would have come to this building looking for a job, trying to be a reporter. Maybe she could talk about hobos in Chicago, too. This design is very, very popular in this time period. It's called the Art Deco. And by the way, in 1922, King Tut's tomb was discovered in Egypt. And everybody went King Tut crazy. They loved pyramids, and they loved anything that made them think of Egypt. So we're going to look for pyramids as we come up to the next couple buildings. See if you see any pyramids around. Those pyramids, again, became very popular after King Tut's tomb was discovered. Everybody wanted to do something Egyptian. One of the things they started to talk about in the 1980s here in Chicago was, hey, we need to use the river a little bit more. This is a beautiful, beautiful feature of Chicago. It cleaned it up. We're gonna, when it was built, 1,454 stories tall. Let me try that again. 1,454 feet tall and 110 stories. I've been in the sun a lot today. In any case, they had a force to deal with in terms of nature that was even stronger than earthquakes. Does anybody know what force is stronger than earthquakes for skyscrapers? What do you think? Shout it out.
Wind.
What is it? Wind. Absolutely, it's wind. How do you deal with wind forces that can make the building sway? You don't want to be in a building that's swaying back and forth. It will make you seasick. By the way, what you're seeing right to your left, going past you, is a barge. Barges were used to transport all sorts of things in Chicago's early history, and they're still being used today. So that's called a barge. It's very flat on the bottom, so it didn't have to be a very deep river. Anyway, the Sears Tower had to deal with wind forces, and the architects that designed it, Bruce Graham and Fazil Khan of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, they put their heads together and they came up with the solution, and that was 9 bundled tubes. What does that mean? Well, think about paper towel tubes. And when you have a paper towel tube, one paper towel tube that's empty, it's not very sturdy. But if you were to rubber band 9 together, that's pretty solid, isn't it? And so what they did was they have 9 bundled tubes that are all together bundled up to the 50th floor, and then they break off, 2 more break off at the 60th, 3 break off at the 90th floor, and then the rest go up to, 2 more go up to 110. So as a result, very sturdy and very strong, the Sears Tower. The Sears Tower has a very awesome observation deck. Has anybody been to the top of the sky deck? Did anybody dare to go out on the ledge? Ah, you're very brave, very brave. Was it scary? A little scary? A little scary? Did you take lots of pictures? Yeah. No. Oh my goodness. That is a very popular location to go to see 4 states at one time. You can see Indiana, Wisconsin, what else can you see? Illinois, thank you. And also Michigan on a clear day. It's quite a fantastic view. Another fantastic view is the building that's right next to where American Girl Store is, that John Hancock. You can get a great view of Navy Pier from there. In any case, the Sears Tower used to be the home of the Sears department store. And then they moved out. And for a long time, different people were keeping their offices there. And then fairly recently, an insurance company named Willis from England made a deal that if they renamed the building after them, then they would come and they would live there. Their offices would. And so that's why it's called the Willis Tower today. Chicagoans were not very happy about that because we didn't like that name change. It was the world's tallest building until 1996. So from 1974 to 1996, long time. We loved that claim to fame. But then it was taken over by a tower called Petronas Towers in a place called Kuala Lumpur, Indonesia. And they kind of cheated because they used spires which didn't have any people staying in them. They were just decorative on the top. And they were only 89 stories tall in comparison to 110. But then another building was built in Taipei, which was very tall. And now the tallest building in the entire world is in a place called Dubai. And it's the Burj Khalifa, and that's 2,717 feet tall. So the Sears Tower is definitely not even in the running. That would be like the Sears Tower with another Sears Tower on top of it almost.
Wow.
Absolutely amazingly tall. But we still say that we have the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere and certainly in North America. Isn't that kind of an interesting building, that gray building right there? That was just about to be completed. It looks like drawers coming out. Doesn't it look like a dresser where you leave your drawers out? Those are balconies for a residence. That was designed by Ralph Johnson. Lots and lots of people are moving back into the city because there's lots to do in the city and it's become so attractive. And so now they need lots of condos and apartment buildings coming up. Now lately it has been, as you can tell, incredibly hot. What's providing the air conditioning for many of these buildings? This building right to your right, where it says Thermal Chicago. This was designed by Eckenhoff Saunders, and it's a big ice cube making factory. They make ice cubes there at nighttime when the electric rates are low, tons and tons and tons of ice. And then what they do during the day is they run water over the ice cubes and send it out to all the various buildings, and it provides the cold water for the air conditioners. How about that? Looks like a boat. They made it look like a boat. This concrete right here is where they're fixing up Wacker Drive, that underground area that we saw a little bit earlier. They're making it up to date. It was built in the 1920s, and this section hasn't been updated. When we go underneath the bridge, look directly up to the right, and you see sort of a pink and gray building. That looks like almost a Lego building. Like this is 311 South Wacker. By Cone, Peterson, and Fox, and on the top, when you see it from a distance, and we'll see it from a distance, it lights up with almost 2,000 fluorescent lights. It was so bright when they first built it in the 1980s that it was throwing birds' migration off. Julie would have definitely been protesting that because birds were very confused about where they were going, and so they had to dim the lights a bit so that they could get it right and migrate in the right place. They estimate that over, I heard this, 7 million birds migrate through Chicago each year. Isn't that amazing? I have no idea how they figure that out, but they're determined to insist that that's the amount. Okay, any of you good at math? Yes. Okay, anybody know what a hypotenuse is? Yes. What is it? the longest edge of a triangle. So look straight up, and that white building that you see right there are two triangles connected at the hypotenuse. There you go. A man by the name of Harry Weiss loved triangles. And so he was a sailor, and he loved building designs with triangles. And so he connected two triangles together at the hypotenuse, one side a little bit taller than the other. He also, oh, by the way, that little park right there, that's called a pocket park. And it's right in between the buildings. There are 566 parks in Chicago, and that's a little mini park in comparison to many of the parks. But what Harry Weiss did was, take a look, he had a regular square column, and he turned it so it looked like it was a triangle. He had fun. One of the cool things about being an architect, if you ever want to be an architect one day, is the sky's the limit with your creativity. You come up with all sorts of different ways to design buildings. A man by the name of Bertrand Goldberg believed that there were no right angles in nature. And he loved to build buildings that were curvy. And in the 1980s, he designed River City as apartments. He also said, too many people work in the city and then go out to the suburbs to live. I want to make people want to stay in the city because the city's fun. So he made a city within a city, which is like stores and bowling alleys and everything you could need, dry cleaners, everything right there in the bottom of your building to make it extra handy. He hoped to make it more of a snake, kind of S along there, but the rest of it wasn't built. One of the neat features is that it has a marina that is open 365 days a year. Even when the river freezes, that marina, the water is always churning, and so people can keep their boats there. If you live there, you can keep your boat there. It's pretty awesome. They've been having a party here all day. The windows are a little bit different than most windows. They're kind of like eyelashes, aren't they, or eyelids. Good view. All right, as you turn your attention to the right, you see all sorts of power equipment. And you're going to be coming up on a tower. Look for it. It's alternating white. So it looks like a radio tower. It's alternating white, orange, white, orange, white, orange. And then behind it is going to be a brown building, which is the home of the Chicago Fire Academy. And ironically, which means that's unusual, it is built on the same site as the O'Leary Barn. It was in the O'Leary Barn that the fire began, October 8th, 1871. It burned for 36 hours. And again, as I mentioned on the bus ride, for those of you who are on bus one, that the fire destroyed 17,000 buildings, left 100,000 people homeless, or 1/3 of the population, burnt 4 square miles, and it created an opportunity for Chicago to rebuild unlike any other city ever had. It was an open slate. Architects could come with new ideas and try some new things, and they did. All right, so we're coming up on it right now. Take a look over to the right. You see Marshall's and LA Fitness, and you see that little tower that's blinking? You see that? And then right down below it is a little brown building. That's Chicago Fire Academy, and they also have a museum there for the Chicago Fire. It's kind of interesting to see where the location was of that. That's a very important event in Chicago history, because without that, we probably would not have been the birthplace of the Skyscraper. Probably would have happened someplace else. But after that, the Skyscraper was born in 1884. Now we're going to be slowly turning here. And this is an awesome opportunity to do a couple things. Number one, to get up and stretch a little bit.